Welcome to the Manuscript Academy podcast,
brought to you by
a writer
and an agent
who both believe that education is key.
The beauty is the people you meet along the way.
And that community makes all the difference.
Here at the Manuscript Academy, you can learn the skills, make the connections, and have access to experts, all from home.
I'm Julie Kingsley.
And I'm Jessica Sinsheimer.
Put down your pens, pause your word counts, and enjoy.
I am Erica Bauman. I am an agent at Aevitas Creative Management. I have been with them since 2015. I work on primarily children's and adult fiction. On the kids side, I do everything from middle grade and up, essentially. My tastes are pretty varied. I do a lot in the speculative fiction space just because that feels like home to me. But I love mysteries and thrillers and horror and contemporary and rom-coms. I would really love a rom-com. Definitely looking for that. And just great stories and great storytellers.
Hi, everybody. We are here with special guest Erica Bauman from Aevitas Creative Management. And you may remember her from our agent help desk a few months ago. You were such a great guest for that. Thank you so much for helping everybody.
Thank you. No, that was so much fun. I loved doing that. And I loved talking to all the writers and answering their questions. It was a blast.
Yeah, well, there's so much that as a writer you can't Google because it all comes with all this nuance to it, right? And so you'll get 100 answers in one direction, 100 in another, and most of them miss the fact that it's all very complicated and individual a lot of the time.
Exactly. So much of this industry is subjective that, you do get a lot of different answers. And sometimes the best way to troubleshoot the problems is to hear all those different data points and try to figure out where the trends are.
So tell us, what are you looking for right now? What's your biggest thing on your wish list?
Oh, that's a great question. The overall vague answer is just beautiful storytelling that sweeps me up and makes me forget reality for a little bit. Because let's be honest, I really want to get lost in a good book right now on a more zoomed in level. I really love romantasy. I feel like everyone is giving that answer, but that kind of cozy character focused fantasy more so than a big world sweeping epic. I love what may seem like smaller stakes, but to the characters themselves feel like earth shattering stakes. I love those sort of personal stories that, are really comforting. And on the opposite side of that coin, I'm a big fan of horror. I'm very happy that horror is having a moment. For me in particular, summer always makes me think of scary campfire stories. So I really love scary stories this time of year. I was having this conversation with a couple of my colleagues the other night because I love horror. I'm the biggest scaredy cat though. They're actually helping me build up my tolerance to watch horror movies because I can't. For me, it's like the gore. My brain can't process that. But I love jump scares and really weird creaturey, supernatural stuff. So that kind of translates over to my reading taste as well, where I really love horror that, again, is very personal and maybe not vast and epic, but has very personal stakes to the characters and explores kind of the horrors of existence in a very relatable way, but maybe not super gory because I am sensitive.
Okay, so I'm thinking with all of these meta tags together, put them in a blender. You would love a book that is a rom-com on the movie set of a horror movie, and then it turns out there's a speculative element too.
Yes. So basically take the new movie Maxine and add in a rom-com and it's great.
I love the idea of this too. What do we get? Let's find out.
Yeah, just kitchen sink it. Let's do it all. Why not?
So I'm going to ask a question for both of you about this because I think I've seen this come up in queries recently where someone's like, it's horror, and then I will have all the meta tags. What is the best way to pitch a story that does have all these elements? Should you just choose one genre and then play with comps? What's the best way to do this for writers?
That's a great question. And it's one I feel like I get a lot from writers who are playing with projects that tiptoe across that line between genres. I always feel like when a project is genre bendy, there's still kind of one genre that maybe comes out on the top, like the A genre with elements of a B genre. So thinking about if you were to kind of take a step back and look at the full view of your manuscript, what would you say is the primary flavor of it, and start with that as the genre, but also to use kind of those elements. So if the main genre is, for example, fantasy, but it's got a little bit of mystery element to it, I categorize this as fantasy genre with elements of mystery. Maybe you bring in the comp titles like, it's film noir, but with fantastical creatures, and describe it that way.
That sounds very readable and
fun. I'd love to see a film noir fantasy.
I'd love to see
really
Shrek
cool.
solve crimes.
Maybe that's the plot for the new Shrek movie. We don't know yet.
Donkey's always up to something. I think it's true, though, that one element usually has to have a little bit more emphasis than the other. I would say it's usually 70-30-ish. There's what is your book major in? What is it minor in? It's really hard to do a double major. And of course, it's so different to have a fantasy with a romantic element than a romantic book with a fantasy element. Why do you think it is that we need to have emphasis in one area versus evenly distributed?
Oh, that is a great question. I think that it kind of comes down to those genre rules that fans of that genre go in and anticipate. For example, romance has very, very clear, distinct rules. It follows a main couple and they have a happily ever after in the end. Those are the two rules of romance. So when it comes down to blending genres like that, one genre's rules are kind of going to become the framework of the story you're writing. So if you're writing and it's like a romance blended with horror, if it follows a main couple and they have a happily ever after at the end, then it's a romance horror versus, if it follows a main couple, but also a lot of other characters and they all die at the end, that's not a romance. That's a horror with romantic elements to it.
Yeah, if you have a pink cover and everything is fine and they meet at a coffee shop and she's clumsy and it's adorable and she drops things and the zombie comes out and beheads her, you're going to have a riot on your hands. Simon & Schuster, whoever published that, is going to have a lot of angry letters. People will hate it online. If you subvert the expectations that much, look out.
Exactly. Like there's a lot of flexibility and gray area in publishing and in any creative endeavor, but for a lot of fans, there are certain rules that they do expect and are very vocal.
It really upsets people. I would like to talk about how there are so many of us who work in scary genres. I work a little more in thriller than I do in horror. There are so many of us who are quite sensitive and can't handle gore, and yet love the end of the genre that's a little bit more upmarket, a little bit more psychological, the horror that has more of an attachment to things that are happening in real life. And how do you talk to people about, I'm okay with this scary thing, but not that scary thing?
I don't think it's all that different from any other personal predilection or subjective leanings in any creative form. Like when it comes to horror, I definitely have clear boundaries just based on my own bodily responses to things. Bringing it back to romance, I feel like everyone has a preferred trope that when they hear a book or a rom-com has that trope, they're like, yes, absolutely. I don't even care what the story is about. There's only one bed. Yes, thank you. And I think it's kind of the same for horror, where some folks really love that gore, like the harder, the better. That's just not me. Whereas some, they like the aspects of horror that either investigate something that's deeply relatable through a lens that is fantastical, so that they can have that separation of like, oh, this is something that actually worries me in my own real life, but through this supernatural lens, it's scary in a different way and in a less personal way. And I think people are drawn to that, maybe are not drawn to other aspects of the genre, and have to create those boundaries where it's like, oh, this is getting a little too close to home. I'm no longer enjoying the detachment from reality that I had before.
The thing is, you're not going to get nightmares from a forced togetherness trope if you just hate that trope. You might very well get nightmares from things people send you in your inbox and you have no idea what's in there until you get there. So I think it's interesting that there are a lot of folks who just kind of have those lines of like, love this kind, don't like this kind. And that's why we have to talk about what we like within the genre.
So do you both want trigger warnings?
I don't know that it's a trigger per se.
I have started kind of leaving a space on my query form for trigger warnings, but that's not exclusively for horror genre. Like there are things like, for example, I am a softie, and if the dog dies, I can't handle it. I can't cope. So That is the trigger warning I will happily accept. Please let me know if the dog dies, because that is very important to my sanity. I find trigger warnings are helpful just because you don't know what will and won't work. I've read horror manuscripts where, for example, I personally have a history of injury and dislocating joints. It's really annoying, but I've dislocated various joints like 7 times now. So for me, when I read that in a story, or if I'm watching a movie and someone's knee gets kicked in the wrong direction, it's deeply triggering for me because it's drawing on that personal history. So I find trigger warnings just helpful in that sense, because I know if I'm caught by surprise by something that may seem very benign to a lot of people, for me, it's just, I will almost throw up sometimes because it's just bringing back so many personal memories.
Well, it's tough too, because I've seen writers say every agent should list everything that might possibly be triggering to them. And to me, I'm like, I am not going to ask agents in a professional capacity to put all of their trauma on the internet. So I understand that it is easier for writers to not list everything that could be in everything. I do think, at the beginning of a chapter is quite polite. But if writers out there are wondering why we didn't require everyone to list their personal triggers, that is why. Going back to horror, what kind of horror in particular do you think is really having a moment like now?
I think it's being referred to as socially conscious horror, horror that's either inspired by a certain aspect of life or a certain aspect of identity, that it takes, what's really going on in the world these days and gives it that twist that heightens the unreality of it or the horrificness of it in a very specific way. I think that, like Jordan Peele does it so well, top of the genre, but a movie like It Follows is one of my favorites, or The Babadook, which is a great one, which that one in particular, it's taking grief and creating a physical manifestation of the idea of grief and depression and having that hunt characters and haunt them. I think is a very pointed way of exploring something that is deeply relatable to so many people through a lens that, it's not as closely tied and realistic, because I don't think a physical manifestation of grief is going to chase me around my apartment anytime soon. But it's relatable in the sense where it's like, okay, I can step back and see the fantastical element of it, but I can also relate on a deeply emotional level.
It's almost like there's enough intellectual scaffolding that it keeps you safe from the full force of everything else going on.
Exactly.
That's so interesting. The books where it takes the parts of real life we can't always explain, it makes them a metaphor, makes them come alive. That to me is a really particularly interesting subgenre of a lot of genres.
Yeah, there's something really powerful about holding up a mirror to the reader or to the viewer, whatever the medium is, but it's not a perfect mirror. It kind of distorts in a way, but still gets the point across.
So we have horror, but you're also doing children's book literature. So what do you see in children? What are the trends? What's going on? What's exciting for you there?
That's a pretty broad one to answer, because I feel like the different age categories in children's, there's different things that are doing well. For example, I feel like we're seeing a return loop in YA where vampires and dystopian are coming back, which makes me happy, but also makes me double check the calendar to try to remember what year it is. Whereas in middle grade, stories that have a great sense of adventure are kind of a perennial interest, books where kids can have fun and get lost and feel the excitement. Like Percy Jackson is very obvious kind of example, but even something that's maybe more contemporary, less fantastical, but still has a great sense of excitement and a sweep to it, I think a lot of kids are interested in. Middle grade is a tough one right now, but I think that kind of feeling in particular is something that readers there are always looking for.
What I hear is that across genres, you want atmospheric, fast pacing or interesting pacing, where you really are having all the feels as you go through. Do you have any tips for writers that want to write these amazing atmospheric, engrossing pieces of work?
I think for a lot of writers, the key is to really push yourself as you're revising and to not be too precious with your story. Writing a book, it's not easy. You get an idea and you put pen to paper, and more often than not, the first draft is usually big and maybe a bit of a mess. And you put all your ideas on the page, and now you have to step back and refocus and look at the overall story and take this piece of marble and chisel away at it until you get the sculpture within. And I think as writers go through that process and really want that fun, sweeping, captivating story, they have to always have a clear sense in their mind what they want the reader to take away from it. Always think about that and what your intentions are as the author and what you hope you are communicating to the reader and what they're taking away as each scene progresses. And then to not be too precious. I feel like everyone has the experience where they write a really beautiful sentence or paragraph, but it's not actually doing anything for you. It's just beautiful. And that sort of ornamentation, at some point or the other, you kind of have to look at it and say, I like this, but it's not clarifying anything. It's maybe undercutting my intentions and not being too precious about it and saying, well, you're going in the separate Word document of all the things I've cut that will live on my hard drive. And maybe we'll see the light of day somewhere else, but not in this project.
It's interesting because, Julia, when you asked that, my first thought was, I have no idea. And then I was thinking about it some more. Erica, we're asking you some incredibly hard questions today, and it is 1 billion degrees in New York. So thank you for rolling with all of this. And I love your answers, and you're so good at just like coming up with all of the nuance from all of the different angles of the question and the answer in the moment, which I want to say I appreciate that so much.
Thank you. No, I love like diving in and dissecting things and thinking about it because so much of this industry is weird and not translatable to anything else. So having this kind of deep conversation, like a lot of my friends and family do not work in the publishing industry. So they don't always understand when I'm like, this character did this thing and it didn't make sense. And I got very angry. It didn't make sense. And they're like, what?
Well, it's like a lot of human experience that could be turned into a metaphor and then something in a horror novel. But we kind of have to talk around it at first until we know, sometimes things happen and we don't know that there's a term out there for it. We just don't know. So we kind of talk around it. We give imagery. I think the answer to the atmospheric question, I was thinking while you were talking, also has an element of the sensory. Right? So if we think about the really atmospheric books we've read, we can often picture what it looked like, what was in the landscape, what the temperature was like, all of the little elements of like, what do you feel on your skin at that time? Is it raining? Is it this? Is it that? And so I wonder if the physicality has a huge amount to do with the atmosphere overall as well.
I feel like something that we see a lot with authors who are maybe just starting out, maybe haven't written a lot before, is that when they start writing, focus on one sense, usually sight in particular, where they'll describe what's going on, but it doesn't feel gripping because they're not digging deep enough. They're neglecting the other senses. Sense of smell is a really evocative one. Touch as well, where you can describe summer in New York physically with the sun shining and the light reflecting off the glass, but you're neglecting the scent of hot garbage and the sense of that you're walking into a gym sauna every time you step out of the air conditioning. And those just bring it to life so much more. And I feel like that's something that writers have to find over the course. And it's only something that you can learn just by doing more and more of. And the more writers write, the better they are at integrating all those senses and that tactile description into that story to paint a vivid picture. And the more they do it, the more instinctive it becomes, where they don't have to focus on, oh, I've done a lot of visual description, but what does this food taste like actually? Or what does this perfume smell like? That it becomes more instinctive the more they do it, and that they've become better at filtering that. So it's not abundance of description that is dense to read, but more, just the necessary points so that a story can really come alive and not lose the pacing with like a big chunk of scenic description.
Kind of like how we were talking before about how if there's enough intellectual scaffolding to keep some of the more gruesome horror elements away, it might always be a tension of how much are we in our heads, how much are we in our bodies. And so if we're saying it was 101 degrees, the pavement was 105, and it was 4:55 p.m., that's very much in our heads. If we say a cockroach the size of a fork just flew by, and it looks like even it is sweating, we've zoomed right in, we're there.
And it's asking a lot of the reader to remember as well. If you're saying it's 105 degrees outside, as a reader, you kind of internally process like, oh, that's important information that I need to retain, when it's actually not.
Yeah. Are we preparing for a pop quiz, or are you inviting me into your dinner party and giving us warm introductions?
It's funny you say that, because I'm just going to give a shout out to a book right now. I'm reading The Midnight Feast by Lucy Foley. And it is the most amazing case study in atmospheric writing. Just looking at what other people do and looking at how this is like multiple POVs. So you have the different smells from the different stakes of the different people within the world. And I think that what I'm really loving about it is it's like this slow simmering attention with time back and forth. But it's also, that I know exactly this place and that I could draw the place. I could make a mood board about this place. And I think that if there's a book that you can walk away from, that you could actually make the mood board for it, almost like you would for like a elementary kid trying to like, what did you understand about this? What can you compare and contrast? But what do you know on your own, right? So I think what we're talking about is fantastical worlds, whatever that means, whether it's contemporary side or to the full-on dystopian. But if we can just get it on a human level, then we're usually right there.
So you know how I love to give people assignments. New assignment. Go have someone read your first 10 pages and then make a Pinterest board. If it matches, you've probably done a good job.
That's a great one. I'm a big fan of mood boards and Pinterest in general, so that's a great one.
A question about dystopia. So let's say we've got a Venn diagram. We've got the dystopian genre over here. We've got the real world here. When both of them are a circle, how does dystopia as a genre change?
Oh, man, that is a great question, because we really are living in dystopian times right now. I think with dystopia as a genre, it still has that sense of believability, where you look at something like the Hunger Games and you're like, yeah, I could see if our country fell apart, it could fall apart in this way. But dystopia as a genre is always at least 5 minutes in the future. It's never perfectly aligned with the real world. It's always slightly ahead. It's foretelling, it's, precautionary. It's Cassandra with her visions and saying, hey, if we don't change this now, this could be what's down the road waiting for us. And I think that's the difference. And that's why it's not always a perfect circle.
I love the idea of 5 minutes in the future, near future sci-fi. Can you explain some of those for our listeners?
Yeah, I think when it comes to science fiction and stories that involve the future, there's a lot of different waypoints. Like 5 minutes in the future is as close as it gets to the present day, but there's maybe one or two very slight elements that make it feel more advanced than the world we currently live in. Like, for example, I feel like Black Mirror does a couple of episodes where it's like very slightly ahead in the future just due to one specific aspect versus, kind of further down the road where it's like maybe 100 years in the future and we're seeing even more differences from the present day. It's the further you go down the timeline, the more changes there are from the familiarity of the present, and the more, as an author, the more world building and development that you have to integrate on all different levels of your story.
So near future could be like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah, definitely. I would say as much as 50 years in the future, something that, someone reading it may still be alive when that version of the future happens.
And when you were talking about 5 minutes in the future, I was just picturing, because something like this would totally happen. Some agent rejecting a book. Sorry, this is only 4.5 minutes in the future. Nope.
Yeah, it's a little too close to home right now.
And I hope they would say that versus just like, no.
Yes. I mean, I definitely hope they would communicate that. It is hard these days to give personalized feedback. I try to give at least some. I actually just recently started using different kind of versions of past letters so that I can easily identify, like, this is why I'm passing. Just hopefully it's helpful for writers, but it is hard just with the sheer volume to give personalized feedback to everyone.
That is the way to go, I think. The multiple rejection templates. I used to have like 10 or 15 going.
I like it so far. I do like having that because I feel like that also helps me as an agent. Rather than just sending a vague, impersonal form letter, I'm letting you know, like, I'm passing on this because the word count is too long, or because I have something similar on my list, or because there is a specific aspect to the concept that I find personally triggering and it's purely subjective and someone else will get it. I think that not only helps the author, but helps me as an agent, that I can hopefully focus my list down so that author kind of learns, like, oh, okay, this agent, can't handle dogs dying in the book. So maybe let's stop sending her books about dogs dying.
I'm sure at some point there will be a way for us to check boxes of what we like and what we don't like, and then it will put it all together in a nice letter that looks like a human wrote it.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's maybe the next query tracker upgrade.
4.5 minutes in the future.
Well, speaking of inbox, can you give us a sense of what your inbox looks like? Like, are you seeing more now? Are you seeing less? You talked about how busy the industry is feeling, but for the writers at home, what does it look like? How many new submissions do you get daily?
Yeah, so I've definitely been seeing more, and I think it's partially because there are more authors out there writing and querying manuscripts, but also as an agent, the longer you're in the industry, the more queries you just see as you establish yourself and build a reputation and a client list and a track record. So it's those two factors kind of converging. I recently implemented the system where I would only open my query inbox for the first week of each month, because before that, I would have periods where my query inbox was open all the time. It just snowballed out of control and I couldn't keep up and stay on top of it. And I'm one of those people who gets deeply anxious when I have unread emails and things on my to-do list that I have to get it done and get it out and sort it away. So I started doing, just open for the first week of each month. And then the rest of the month was a little bit of a breather and a chance for me to catch up. And it was working well. And then as soon as that pile started to get out of control, I think I did it for 3 months. And then I was like, okay, I need to hit pause for a little bit, take the summer to catch up. Because I also had requested manuscripts that I had been in my inbox for a while. I was very behind on that and needed to read and get back to. And there were a lot of great projects in my query inbox that I wanted to request, but I didn't think it was fair to do that too soon until I got back to these other authors who had been waiting. So I hit pause for the summer. And when I hit pause, I had over 1,000 unread queries in my inbox. And I had been trying to keep up and I thought I was doing really well. But even so, it got a lot. I'm actually down to a little over 400 at this point from 1,000, which I'm very excited about.
I think inbox zero is a myth. I think they made it up.
I constantly aim for it and see where I land. One day I will have inbox zero for a blessed 20 minutes before that all goes away.
It's really interesting because it's like whenever I talk to writers about this, whenever there's somebody, in whatever social media DMs being like, hey, Jessica, can you just read these 100 pages and tell me what you think? And then I'm like, I wish I could. The reaction I almost always get is, well, if you cared about writers, you would. And then it's like, but if I said yes to everybody, I'd have to live to be like several hundred years old.
Yeah, I feel like agenting is constantly finding the balance between wanting to keep your options open and be receptive to the projects that come your way, because you never know, A, where the next great project is going to come from, but also you do want to help writers in, we all want writers to succeed and to do well. I constantly wish I could have more talks with writers and kind of help them, because I love problem solving, story problems. Like, that's why I got into this industry. But you constantly have to weigh it against, you are one person and you only have so much time in the day. And you cannot work all the time. You need to eat, you need to sleep. And when you do the math, there are only so many hours in the day. And you have to still prioritize your existing client list as well. The really tragic reality is that there's very little time for queries and helping new writers. And you kind of have to pick and choose. Like, it's funny, even when I'm close to queries, I'm still getting projects, things that are coming in through my email as referrals or from my colleagues who are like, hey, I have this writer who wants to write a children's book. That's not my area. Do you want to take a look at this?
We have the quicksand problem here sometimes at the Manuscript Academy. But if you're out there and you're listening, and like we all see the rage that can hit on Twitter, like agents are against us. They said they wanted it, and then I gave it to them and they didn't take it. And, we see that. But I think that everyone needs to remember there's no other industry in the world. Like, no one says to an accountant, can you just look at this for me via their DMs? They just don't.
Yeah.
So I think if you're out there, just remember that everyone is doing their best. The humans are humans are humans. And somehow in creative industries, we don't treat people the same way is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. And I understand where that frustration and that anger comes from, because writing, even when you're writing fiction, it is coming from a deeply personal place. You're either writing from a personal place, either of your own experience, or even in the sense of, you may be writing a second world high fantasy, but you spent months living in this world and this story. It's still a part of you. So that I understand when you send it out to agents and you get that rejection, it feels like a personal attack. Believe me, I struggle with the same thing when I send my clients' work out to editors. Like, I know it's professional and it's not personal, but still, when I get those pass letters back, my first instinct is like, well, you're wrong. One day I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, but you're wrong. You still have that moment of taking it a little personally. But when it comes to that frustration of like, well, this agent said they wanted this type of story, why did they pass on this? I think one thing to remember is that when we're seeing pitches, whether it's through like a Twitter pitch contest or when we're seeing queries in our own inbox, we're only seeing a tiny sliver of the manuscript. And we're trying to make a gut call based on that. Is this something I'm interested in and want to read more of? And is this something I feel confident that I could sell? Or is this not for me? And when an agent either passes on a query or requests the full manuscript and then passes on that, in a way, it's kind of the same thing of when you see a trailer for a movie and you're like, that trailer looks awesome. I'm so excited to see that movie. And then when you actually see the full movie, it doesn't meet those expectations that you built up in your head. And whether or not it's a good movie is besides the point. But if you went in expecting a certain thing and what the product is didn't align with that, it's not that it's bad in any sense. It's just that it wasn't what you were hoping for, so it's not the right fit for you.
And kind of like the movies that have multiple trailers. And oddly, sometimes trailer A looks like a completely different movie than trailer B, even if they're both correct. There are so many right ways to pitch your book. I would argue there are at least 10 correct ways to pitch every book in the world. And I think a lot of writers feel like it's this almost needle in a haystack thing. There was one right way. I had to find that one right way or else. And I just don't think that's it. I think it's how do we create an image strong enough that it stays with us?
It's the writer's job to get the work the best that it can be. And when it's the best, and you know that you have the best query that represents your work, and you keep putting it out there. We were just talking to a writer that is at the place of champagne rejections, right? And you're starting to get those. You just keep putting it out there. Don't go on Twitter and get mad. Don't go on a Facebook page and get mad. Just temper those feelings and keep going. So in this industry, it really is getting to that sweet spot with a story, right? And once you're there, multiple agents will kind of swarm around it and the tables are turned. And your job is to get to that swarm.
Yeah. When you get to that place where a lot of the passes that you're getting are just like overflowing with compliments, but it's just a matter of not quite aligning with either that person's skills or what they were looking for. Believe me, I can understand that it gets so frustrating. I've been in that position several times where I'm like, someone please buy this. Like, I love the compliments, keep them coming, but someone put your money where your mouth is. I get the frustration there, but that's, like you said, that's exactly not the time to vent or to go in and retool your manuscript. Like, you're getting compliments. You've reached the point where It's finding the right person at the right time. And time is so critical to every stage of this industry. And it's something that's entirely outside of everyone's control. That, it's not just having a great manuscript, but it landing in the right person's inbox at the right time where they can turn to it and say, yes, this is exactly what I need right now. And it's frustrating. I completely understand, because that's something that as a writer, you can't plan for. But when the elements and when all the things line up and that happens, it's a cascade effect of opportunity.
I love when a friend has just told me about a new idea, and then I open my inbox and there it is. And obviously, completely out of everyone's control except for the usual zeitgeisty reasons. But that little bit of synchronicity there can make a huge difference to me. And I feel like whatever you happen to see in your day or how you're even feeling that day can completely, almost as if change your sunglasses that you're putting on while you read. The filter through which you see everything can completely change too.
Yeah, it's like I always remember when I'm reading through my queries and when I request a manuscript, more often than not, I won't be able to dive into that manuscript immediately. It'll sit in my inbox for a little bit because I've got other things that need to take precedence. And as excited as I am for that manuscript, I can't dive into it right away because I have responsibilities and people that I owe responses to. But when I do, I always remember where I am when I'm first reading that manuscript that just hits in the right way. I very vividly remember like one book I was reading and felt myself getting more and more excited about. And I was on the stationary bike. So as I was reading it and getting more swept up in the story, I was pedaling faster. And I was like, great, heart rate's up, good to go. Whereas another book I very vividly remember reading in a hammock on vacation. And it was like, that was the perfect match to the vibe of where I was at the time. And it's so powerfully that I turned around and made an offer to the writer. It really is outside of people's control. That kind of divine alignment, in a sense, is really what needs to happen a lot of the times.
I think writers think we are looking for something that checks boxes or is a row on a spreadsheet, when what we're really looking for is kismet.
Exactly. Like I have definitely seen projects come through my inbox where on paper, all of the things that they're describing sound right up my alley. It sounds great. And I'm so excited. And then I start reading the book, and it's not just the list of ingredients, but it's the proportion and it's how they're tempered into the story that is the subjective aspect. And that's where it's, yes, all the boxes are checked, but it's still not quite coming together for me.
Think of all the different kinds of bread you can make with the exact same ingredients.
Absolutely. Like, love bread, love carbs, but I definitely prefer sourdough over rye bread. And there's very clear reasons why.
How do we make writers feel hopeful about the fact that there's still a little touch of the speculative to the query process?
Oh, I think it's not just the query process. I think it's all of publishing. With what is within your control, you can do everything right, and things still may not pan out in the way you predicted. And I think that's just life. You can plan and you can hope for, but there is no, do this and this, and it always comes out this way. There is an element to it that you kind of just have to hope for the best, plan for the worst. I feel like is a lot of agents' mottos. I feel like that's maybe a bit more pessimistic than what you were looking for in an answer, but
the opposite's also true, though. I've seen writers make horrific mistakes and it still works out. I think it almost comes down to, if you are looking for synchronicity, you're much more likely to run into it if you leave your house.
Yes. Like if you don't put yourself out there, you're not going to achieve anything. I feel like so much of this industry, like I feel in my mind that the authors who are the most successful are the ones who, not necessarily had that immediate success right off the bat and it was smooth sailing from there, but the ones who stuck with it, the ones who are still writing or still publishing after 10, 20 years. I think the ones who hold on and ride the Bronco, who stick with it over time and keep coming back, are the ones that I think are the most successful in this industry.
Giving yourself the most chances where something could go right.
Yeah. And I mean, we see it all the time where authors, it's not necessarily their first book that's immediately this huge hit. It's their 9th or their 12th book. And that's a huge breakout success. And suddenly it's like, everyone's like, where have you been all this time? How have I never known? If you had dropped out of the race at this point, you wouldn't have seen this incredible thing happen.
Wayne Gretzky says, you got to take the shot to hit the goal or something like that.
Yeah.
And I guess that's such a great way to think about daily. Every day is an opportunity to find a reader, to find an agent, to find a platform, to find things that you can do for your writing career. It is a business. It is not just a creative, it is a full-on business. Once you are a writer, you are a small business owner here.
I think the books that it's their first book, it sells in a multi-house auction, it's a ton of money. Usually those are the books that fit neatly into a box. I think it's the books with the real staying power that are the ones that defy expectation. And frankly, nuance takes time.
I feel like I say this a lot to my clients, but usually your first book, if you're doing this right, your first book is going to be the worst book you write. And as you mature, both as a person and as a writer, you will get better and you will get stronger and more bold in your choices creatively, but also more thoughtful in how you approach the process. Your first book may hit big, may not, but I think the more you mature and develop as a writer, as a human being, those are the interesting books. And those are the ones that I think when you ask someone, oh, you love this author, what's your favorite book of theirs? Usually it's those books and less so their first book.
Yeah, I think writers have a much, much larger margin of error than they think they do if everything else is going right. If they're being ethical, if they're being kind, if they obviously tried, if the story is good, if the writing is good.
Exactly. And like at the end of the day, those times when all those elements of the query lined up, but I chose not to make an offer on the writer, it came down to how I saw that person behaving and acting and saying, this is not someone that I feel like I would work well with. Maybe someone else would, just not for me.
What are some things writers have been doing well lately?
Oh gosh, I feel like writers have been doing really well in, at least from my perspective, in researching and approaching agents. Like the queries that I have been seeing in my inbox lately, for the most part, like there are still a few where it's like, you categorize this as a fictional rom-com, but it's really a memoir. I don't know what's happening here, but for the most part, you know, it's clear that authors have done their research and I see why they're sending me their project. You know, whether or not it's the right fit for what I'm currently looking for, that's a different story. But I see the thought process behind it. And I think writers are doing a really great job with their research and their outreach to agents. And I think also in terms of query letters, I think 5 years ago, I would have seen a lot more queries in my inbox that didn't have a query letter at all, or maybe had one paragraph. And now I'm seeing a lot more authors know what goes into a query letter, being really thoughtful in crafting them and framing the pitch. You know, it's not always the right fit for me, but that care and attention is not unappreciated at all.
I love it. I love seeing the research right away.
Erica, where can we find you online?
Oh gosh, these days I'm over on Instagram at Erica Bauman Books on Instagram. Sadly, I've given up Twitter. It is just no longer a joyous place for me to be. But Instagram is the primary place to find me. I'm a little bit on Threads, a little bit on Blue Sky when I remember I have that up on my phone. But for the most part, Instagram.
Well, thank you so much. This was great. I love the nuance. I love the idea of these two genres, you know, romantasy being very escapist, horror being very escapist in another way. Very happy to see those be the genres of the summer.
Yeah, we're all looking to lose ourselves in a good book for a couple of hours or days.
Thank you so much, Erica. This is terrific.
Yeah, thank you both. This is so much fun.
We are so glad that you joined us. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Just head on over to the iTunes store and let us know what you think. It not only helps us make this podcast be the best it can be, but it also affects our ratings within the iTunes platform.
We'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling brave and want to submit your page for our First Pages podcast, you can send it to academy@manuscriptwishlist.com with First Pages podcast in the subject line. We'd also just love to hear from you.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Manuscript Academy and everything we have to offer, just jump on over to manuscriptacademy.com.